The intake form said Tier 3, so I sat in Tier 3. I didn't know what Tier 3 was. The sorting AI at Drenith's front desk had processed my colony credential packet, run whatever calculation it ran, and printed a chit with a room number. I found the room. I sat in it. I was 16 years old, and 6 transit days from the nearest thing I'd ever called home, and I wasn't going to argue with a printed chit. The room was a lecture chamber, which I recognized. Elevated rings of curved bench desks, a central floor where the instructor would stand, hollow display panels along 3 walls. The cadets already seated were older than me, not by a little. The Vel Sorvani sitting 2 rows ahead had the elongated secondary joints that their species developed past 22. The Keth Sorvani beside him had full stripe development along his collar line. That didn't complete until mid-20s, based on the xenobiology survey in my station's archive. I was the youngest person in the room by what looked like 6 years. Nobody said anything to me. The Keth Sorvani with the full stripes looked at me the way you look at something that has walked into the wrong place and hasn't realized it yet. The lecturer arrived. Prenosath, according to the wall panel, a Keth Sorvani himself, ridge crests running pale amber, which in that species signals a professor who has given this exact lecture enough times that it has stopped costing him anything. He did not acknowledge me. He pulled up the first display panel and began. The lecture was called Cognition and Initial Conditions. The thesis, as near as I could follow it in the first 10 minutes, was this: no cognitive system, biological, synthetic, or hybrid, can generate outputs that materially exceed the quality and scope of its initial programming environment. A system learns from what it is given. The ceiling is the input. You cannot exceed your conditions. This was presented not as a hypothesis, but as a settled fact. The kind of thing a lecturer states once, and then builds an entire seminar on top of. I wrote it down. I didn't argue with it. I just wrote it down. Prenosath ran the seminar as a tiered question sequence. 94 questions across 6 domains, starting at what he called introductory threshold and escalating. The purpose, he explained, was to demonstrate the thesis in real time. Each cadet would answer until they reached their classification ceiling. The ceiling was the point. Reaching it wasn't failure, it was data. The room would watch the ceiling arrive for each cadet, and that arrival would illustrate the principle. He started at question 1. Keth Varun, the one with the full stripes, answered the first 31 questions without pausing. Fast, clean, precise. His stripes ran a steady blue-white through each answer, which is the color they hold when a Vel Sorvani is doing something that costs him nothing. He was good. He knew he was good. The room knew it too. Question 32 stopped him. It was a cross-domain integration problem, xenobiological behavioral modeling combined with structural load calculus, and he went quiet for 12 seconds, then gave an answer that was close, but shaded wrong on the load side. Prenosath marked it. Keth Varun's stripes shifted. Not much. Just enough. He found his ceiling at 32. That was, apparently, a strong result. The questions continued. Other cadets answered some, passed on others, hit their own ceilings at 28 and 24 and 36. The room was performing exactly as Prenosath intended. The principle was demonstrating itself in live data. I kept my hand down. Not because I didn't have answers. I had answers. I had been sitting with answers since question 4, when Prenosath had asked about pressure differential behavior in low-gravity hydroponic systems, and I had recognized it as the exact problem our station's agricultural block fought every cycle for 11 years. I'd spent 3 years helping Mira Sona troubleshoot that system by reading every manual she had, which meant I'd also read the structural engineering context those manuals assumed you already knew, which meant I'd read the foundational xenobiology surveys those engineering texts referenced, which meant by the time I was 13, I had pulled in more cross-domain material than the question was testing for. But I didn't know this room. I didn't know what it meant to answer here, so I kept my hand down, and I kept writing things down, and I watched Keth Varun's stripes do interesting things every time someone reached their ceiling lower than his. He noticed I wasn't answering. I could tell because he stopped watching the display panel and started watching me. His stripes ran a slow pulse, amber to white, which in Vel Sorvani is the equivalent of narrowed eyes. Not hostile yet, just noting. I kept writing. There was a lot worth writing down. At question 47, he said, "The transfer hasn't answered once." He didn't phrase it as a question. He said it to the room, which was a particular kind of move. Not an accusation, technically, but a spotlight. Prenosath's ridge crests shifted from amber to a slightly cooler tone as he turned to look at me. "The transfer is welcome to attempt the current question," Prenosath said. Question 47 was a signal propagation problem rooted in pre-consolidation communication theory. The answer required knowing that the standard propagation model was built on Kelvarathi atmospheric assumptions, which didn't apply in the question's stated conditions, and then substituting the correct baseline from an older framework that most licensed curricula had deprecated. I knew the older framework. My station's navigation archive was built on it. We used it every time we ran an atmospheric relay because we couldn't afford the licensed update. I gave the answer. Prenosath's ridge crests didn't move for a moment. Then he marked it correct and moved to question 48. I answered 48, then 49. I didn't stop. Not because I was making a point. The questions were just open, and I had the answers, and so I answered them. 50 ran into xenobiology. 51 was structural. 53 crossed both, which was where Keth Varun's ceiling had been, and I answered it correctly because I knew the load calculus from the same source I'd learned the biology, the station's maintenance manual for the outer hull ring, which had been written by someone who clearly thought the reader already understood both disciplines and didn't slow down for either. The room got quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. At question 60, one of the older Vel Sorvani in the back row leaned forward on his bench. I noticed because the movement changed the ambient light in my peripheral field. Their bioluminescent skin tone shifts when they shift posture, a passive thermal response. He was paying attention in a way he hadn't been paying attention before. Prenosath kept asking. I kept answering. His ridge crests had gone a color I didn't have a name for. Not the settled amber of a lecture running as intended. Not the cooler tones of someone recalculating. Something between the two. Like a reading that doesn't fit the instrument's scale. Question 74 was the hardest one I'd hit. It ran deep into a domain I'd only grazed, a subfield of cognitive systems theory that I knew only through a recovered pre-consolidation text on educational modeling my station had found in a salvage packet and shelved without really knowing what to do with it. I'd read it twice because it was there. I gave the answer I had, flagged that I was uncertain on one component, and said why. Prenosath marked it. He marked it correct with the caveat I'd already named. Keth Varun's stripes had gone flat. Not dark, just absent of signal. I'd never seen a Vel Sorvani stripe system go quiet like that. It's what happens, I learned later, when the system stops processing and simply holds. I answered through 89 before Prenosath stopped asking. He didn't ask question 90. He stood at the display panel with his ridge crests at that unnamed color, and he was quiet for a beat that ran longer than any of the pauses between questions. The room was very still. Then he said, "What institution provided your secondary credential?" "No institution," I said. "We used whatever the station had." He wrote something on his notation panel. I couldn't see what. He didn't share it. The lecture ended early. Prenosath did not return to the thesis. He dismissed the room without restating the principle, which I thought was interesting, because the principle had been the whole point of the session. I filed out with the others. Keth Varun did not say anything to me. His stripes were still quiet. In the corridor, the older Vel Sorvani from the back row fell into step beside me for a few seconds. He didn't say anything either. He just walked alongside me at a measured pace, which in Vel Sorvani body language means something I had also read about in a survey that I had no business having read. I didn't say anything. I'd learned everything I knew from a station that gave me what it had, which turned out to be enough. It usually was.